It ruled over kings and claimed to be the heir of Rome itself. For 1,000 years, it stood as a pillar of power in the heart of Europe. And yet, the Holy Roman Empire was none of those things. It wasn't holy. It wasn't Roman, and by many measures, it wasn't even an empire. So why did it last for nearly a millennium? Behind the gilded title lies a paradox wrapped in politics, ambition, and deception. This was a realm where emperors wore crowns they didn't inherit, governed lands they didn't control, and answered to a pope they didn't always obey. From Charlemagne's coronation to Napoleon's final blow, this story is not one of glory, but of illusion, survival, and constant reinvention. In this video, you'll uncover how one of the most misunderstood powers in history managed to endure chaos, contradiction, and centuries of shifting alliances. We'll reveal how the Holy Roman Empire rose, and how, despite all odds, it lingered like a ghost of Roman grandeur long after its soul had vanished. Stay until the end, and you may never see European history the same way again. Imagine being a peasant in 14th century Bohemia, taxed by a noble you've never met, ruled by an emperor you've never seen, and preached to in Latin by a priest who speaks of salvation while you starve. The Holy Roman Empire wasn't a place you could find on a map, but its presence haunted every aspect of your daily life. For the common people, it was less an empire and more a distant shadow, confusing, overwhelming, and often merciless. Now picture a German prince in the 16th century. He's not just a nobleman, he's a kingmaker. With one vote, he could elevate a new emperor or bring down an old one. But he must tread carefully. Behind every move is the Pope's influence, rival dynasties, and a web of alliances more tangled than any battlefield. The empire gave him power, but it also demanded allegiance to a throne constantly under siege by politics and faith. And then there were those who dared to challenge the system, reformers like Martin Luther, who shattered the religious uniformity the empire tried to maintain. His defiance ignited wars that tore through its heartlands. For every scholar, knight, or preacher who rose in rebellion, thousands of lives were caught in the fire. The Holy Roman Empire wasn't just a stage for emperors. It was a crucible for millions, shaping destinies through edicts, betrayals, and broken promises. The roots of the Holy Roman Empire stretch back to the ruins of Rome and the chaos of post-classical Europe. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, Europe splintered into warring tribes, kingdoms, and feudal lords. But one idea lingered, the dream of a unified Christendom under a Roman-style ruler. That dream took form in the year 800, when Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans. It was a title soaked in symbolism and politics. Charlemagne ruled much of Western Europe, but this coronation was a calculated message. Rome may have fallen, but its legacy would live on. Charlemagne's empire didn't last. After his death, his vast realm fractured under his heirs, leading to centuries of disunity. But the concept of a Christian empire, divinely ordained and politically dominant, never disappeared. In 962, German King Otto I was crowned by the Pope in a similar fashion, reviving the imperial ideal and marking the official beginning of what would later be known as the Holy Roman Empire. But from its first breath, it was already a compromise, a balancing act between church and crown, between Latin faith and Germanic power. Unlike the ancient Roman Empire, this new empire wasn't built on conquest. It was stitched together through marriages, alliances, and papal approval. Otto had to protect the Pope militarily to receive his blessing, tying the empire's fate to the church. The title of Holy Roman Emperor wasn't passed automatically. It had to be earned, negotiated, or fought for. And every emperor knew, without the Pope's approval, their legitimacy could crumble. This uneasy alliance would define the next centuries. Emperors needed the Pope to crown them, but they also wanted independence from church authority. The result? Power struggles that would shape medieval Europe, with kings and popes excommunicating each other, armies marching on Rome, and thrones rising and falling not by sword alone, but by scripture and signature. By the 12th century, the Holy Roman Empire had transformed into a sprawling web of semi-independent territories, duchies, bishoprics, city-states, and kingdoms, all theoretically under the emperor's rule, but in practice, governed by their own laws and leaders. The emperor was more a mediator than a monarch, often begging for loyalty from princes who saw him as a rival more than a sovereign. This decentralization wasn't a flaw. It was the system. The investiture controversy of the late 11th century exposed the empire's deepest crack. Who had the right to appoint bishops, the Pope or the Emperor? When Emperor Henry IV insisted on his authority, Pope Gregory VII excommunicated him. In a dramatic display of humiliation, Henry walked barefoot in the snow to Canossa in 1077, begging forgiveness. It wasn't just a religious gesture, it was political theater. It showed that even the most powerful secular leader could be brought low by papal power. Meanwhile, as the Crusades raged across the eastern Mediterranean, the Holy Roman Empire played a curious role, supplying knights and rhetoric, but never leading the charge. Unlike France or England, the empire lacked a centralized command to act decisively. Its internal politics were too chaotic. One emperor might support the Pope's crusade, while another might wage war on him. This inconsistency weakened its external influence and revealed a deeper truth. The empire was often too busy fighting itself to project power abroad. And yet, for all its instability, the imperial title remained a coveted prize. Why? Because it carried symbolic weight. To be crowned Holy Roman Emperor was to claim legitimacy over Christendom. It gave a ruler the aura of Caesar and the blessing of God, even if his authority barely extended beyond his own palace walls. This illusion of unity kept the empire alive long after its foundations had crumbled. The 16th century delivered a fatal wound to the illusion of unity, the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his theses in 1517, he didn't just challenge the church, he fractured the empire. Suddenly, princes across the German-speaking world were choosing sides, Catholic or Protestant. The emperor, now Charles V of the powerful Habsburg dynasty, tried to hold it all together through diplomacy, war, and sheer force of will. But the religious map of Europe was changing faster than any crown could control. The empire descended into internal conflict. The Schmalkaldic War, the Peace of Augsburg, and later the 30 Years' War turned the empire into a battleground of faith, power, and survival. By the time the Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648, the empire's political power was hollowed out. The treaty not only ended the war but effectively decentralized the empire even further, recognizing the sovereignty of its countless states. The emperor remained a figurehead, but his voice now echoed across a chorus of competing interests. As Europe moved into the age of absolutism, kingdoms like France, Spain, and England centralized power, built standing armies, and projected authority through colonies and conquest. The Holy Roman Empire, by contrast, remained a patchwork. While Vienna and Berlin rose in importance, the emperor's control over regions like Saxony or Bavaria was mostly ceremonial. Local rulers minted their own coins, led their own armies, and signed their own treaties. The empire had borders, but inside it was more like a federation of mistrust than a unified state. By the 18th century, the title of Holy Roman Emperor was effectively owned by the Habsburgs of Austria. They had turned the imperial throne into a family tradition. But even they knew the truth. The real power lay in Vienna, not in the empire. What had begun as a bold revival of Rome was now a slow-motion mirage, still adorned with rituals, banners, and processions, but increasingly irrelevant in the age of enlightenment and revolution. The Holy Roman Empire was held together not by armies or taxes, but by rituals, bureaucracy, and the careful balance of competing powers. At its core was the concept of elective monarchy. Unlike other hereditary crowns, the emperor had to be chosen by a group of elite nobles known as the prince-electors, a small but powerful circle that included archbishops, dukes, and kings. This electoral process gave the illusion of consensus, but in reality, it was a theater of bribes, promises, and papal pressure. The title was never guaranteed, it was bargained for. The empire had no standing army of its own. Military force was raised ad hoc by the constituent states, each with its own soldiers, loyalties, and objectives. When wars broke out, the emperor had to negotiate for troops like a diplomat, not command them like a general. The result was an empire that could never act quickly. Every decision required consensus, every campaign required compromise. In times of peace, this kept tensions low. In times of war, it bred paralysis. Economically, the empire functioned more like a trade zone than a nation-state. Cities like Nuremberg, Lübeck, and Frankfurt thrived on commerce, But their prosperity came from local governance and intercity networks, not imperial planning. The emperor collected few taxes and had little control over monetary policy. Power rested in regional diets, assemblies, town councils, and merchant guilds. It was a mosaic of self-interest, loosely tied together by symbolic loyalty to the crown. Religiously, the empire depended on a delicate balance. The Peace of Augsburg and later treaties recognized the principle of cuius regio, ius religio. The ruler of each state could determine its religion. This avoided civil war in many cases, but also guaranteed fragmentation. There was no imperial church, no singular religious doctrine, only a patchwork of Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, and later secular regions, all flying the same imperial banner for convenience, not conviction. What truly kept the empire running was inertia and administration. A vast network of scribes, heralds, envoys, and legal scholars maintained the illusion of unity. Imperial diets were held regularly, laws were debated, titles were confirmed, and disputes were resolved, not by force, but by precedent and paper. The Holy Roman Empire didn't govern by decree. It survived by negotiation, by protocol, and by postponement. Its greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. It could absorb conflict, but never eliminate it. One of the most surprising facts about the Holy Roman Empire is that for most of its existence, it had no capital city. Unlike London, Paris, or Madrid, there was no imperial seat. The emperor ruled from wherever he happened to be, Vienna, Aachen, Frankfurt, often traveling with a mobile court of advisors and scribes. This nomadic style of governance wasn't a sign of flexibility. It was a symptom of weakness, a ruler without a center, navigating a realm that refused to be pinned down. Even stranger, the empire's legal name, Sacrum Imperium Romanum, didn't stabilize until the 13th century, and the word nation wasn't added until the 15th, becoming Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. It was a title that tried to project unity, but only highlighted contradiction. It was holy, yet often at odds with the church. Roman, yet centered in Germanic lands. An empire, yet with no empire in the conventional sense. No absolute ruler, no clear borders, and no coherent military force. Perhaps the most ironic moment came at the very end. In 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte, himself a self-made emperor, forced the Holy Roman Emperor Francis II to abdicate. And just like that, a 1,000-year institution dissolved with a letter. No epic battle, no collapse of walls, no dramatic overthrow. Just a signature. The empire that had once claimed to be the heir of Caesar ended not in fire or war, but in quiet paperwork. A fitting end for a system built more on symbols than on swords. The Holy Roman Empire may be gone, but its fingerprints remain all over modern Europe. Its decentralized structure laid the groundwork for the federal model that would later shape countries like Germany and Switzerland. The very idea of uniting multiple states under a shared framework with local autonomy but symbolic central leadership can be traced back to the imperial diets and fragmented sovereignty of the empire's 1,000-year existence. Its legacy also survives in legal and academic traditions. The empire helped preserve Roman law during the Middle Ages, blending it with Germanic customs and creating a legal culture that still influences continental Europe today. Universities that flourished under imperial charters like Heidelberg or Prague became centers of knowledge and reform, birthing thinkers who would later challenge both church and crown. Even its collapse had consequences. The vacuum left by the empire's end helped fuel the rise of German nationalism, leading to the eventual unification of Germany under Prussian leadership in the 19th century. And the centuries of religious fragmentation within the empire set the stage for Europe's modern denominational map. The Holy Roman Empire may have vanished with Napoleon, but the tensions, borders, and mentalities it fostered remain embedded in Europe's political and cultural DNA. Picture this: a golden crown placed on an empty throne in a quiet cathedral. Dust dancing in the morning light. No trumpets. No armies. Just silence. That's how the Holy Roman Empire truly ended. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. It was a ghost of Rome that lingered for centuries, long after its soul had departed. For 1,000 years, men clung to a name, Holy Roman Empire, hoping that by saying it loud enough, it might become true. But titles are not truth. Power is not permanence. And empires built on contradiction eventually crumble under the weight of their own illusions. The Holy Roman Empire stood not because it was strong, but because no one could agree on how to replace it. Its story is a mirror to our own time of fragile alliances, competing powers, and institutions that endure not because they work, but because they're too complex to dismantle. In the end, the Holy Roman Empire was not holy. It was not Roman, and it was not an empire. But it was real, and it shaped the world in ways even its creators could never have imagined.